Chapter 18 of the Red Cross Girls in Belgium. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristin Lewis, Houston, Texas. The Red Cross Girls in Belgium by Margaret Vandercook. Difficulties. Perhaps it was due to Nona Davis's advice, or perhaps to Dick Thornton's own judgment, that he decided to make his position clear to Barbara. He had no thought of her return in his liking. Nevertheless, a confession appeared the more manly and straightforward. But beginning the next day, events moved ahead so swiftly that there was never a chance for Dick to carry out his intention. By noon, a message was sent by his sister Mildred. She explained that soon after breakfast she had been summoned to the German prison for a consultation in regard to Eugenia Peabody. She found the prison officers both embarrassed and annoyed. For the young American woman whom they had been compelled to arrest had become dangerously ill. They had not been prepared for such a contingency. She had been locked up in what had formerly served as an ordinary jail in Brussels, and there were no accommodations for seriously ill persons. They could not determine what should be done. It was extremely awkward to have the prison doctor declare the prisoner a victim of typhoid fever, and to have the physician sent from the American Relief Committee confirm his opinion. Suppose this Miss Peabody should be so inconsiderate as to die? The fact might arouse international complications and would certainly precipitate unpleasant discussion. The young woman had been kept a prisoner for something over a month without a trial, but even in this time important pressure had been exerted for her release. Because she had been an American Red Cross nurse, naturally all Red Cross societies were interested. Moreover, she was said to be a member of an old and prominent New England family who would make themselves heard in her behalf. Then, as if Miss Peabody was herself wealthy and had been using her money for the benefit of the Belgian children, what might not be said in her defense? There was a chance that the German government would be accused of resenting her care of the Belgian children. In order to show their good feeling, Mildred had been permitted to visit Eugenia. She found her friend in a small room like a cell. It was of stone with only one window, a stool, and a cot bed. But whatever Eugenia must have suffered for her breach of faith, she was now past being disturbed by mental unhappiness. For an hour, Mildred sat beside her friend, trying to arouse her. But Eugenia gave no sign of recognition. She did not seem to be enduring pain, but was in a stupor from fever. Mildred felt unhappy and helpless. There was but little chance of her friend's recovery if she remained without the right care. Moreover, the American Red Cross girls owed it to one another to keep together through good and evil fortunes. What would Eugenia have done for one of them under the same circumstances? Mildred tried her best to decide. She implored the prison authorities to allow her to remain and care for her friend, but they refused. It was not that they were unwilling for the prisoner to be properly looked after. It was that there were no arrangements whereby it was practical for Mildred Thornton to continue at the prison. She could come each day and stay for a time with her friend, and this was, of course, a surprising concession. So after Mildred returned to her own quarters, she had sent a note of explanation to her brother. Then began the most anxious week that the Red Cross girls had endured since their arrival in Europe. Before now, anxiety had harassed one or two of them at a time. Now they were all equally concerned. Eugenia did not grow better. From day to day, the report of her condition became worse. Mildred Thornton was the only one of the three girls ever allowed to enter Eugenia's room at the prison. However, Nona and Barbara hovered about the neighborhood like restless ghosts. Indeed, they now appeared as deeply attached to each other as in the early days of their acquaintance. Nor was Dick Thornton much less anxious. He had always liked and admired Eugenia. Although he disapproved her action in regard to Colonel Carton, it was not possibly wholly to object to it. One had to have a sneaky sense of appreciation for a girl or man who would risk so much for an entire stranger. However, interest in Eugenia's condition was not confined to her few friends. In a little while her case became the most talked of in Brussels among the Americans and their acquaintances. Then the news of Eugenia's arrest and the reason for it appeared in the American daily papers together with the account of her critical illness. Afterwards, these facts were copied in the newspapers of England, France, and Russia. Eugenia became an international figure. Now and then Barbara tried to smile, thinking how Eugenia would have resented her notoriety had she been aware of it. But the idea did not create much mirth. It was so far from amusing to picture one's friends at the point of death, shut up in a tiny room, with only such crude care as the prison physician and nurse could give her. The situation was unendurable. Nevertheless, like a great many other situations about which one says this same thing, it had to be endured. The German officials in command of the city of Brussels assuredly grew weary of visits from white-faced American girls and their friends, all bent upon the same quest. Was it not possible that Eugenia be removed to a hospital or to her own home until she recovered? The answer remained the same. Much as the situation had to be deployed, one could not surrender a prisoner because of ill health. Discipline must be enforced. Then a day came when Mildred and Dick Thornton were granted an unexpected interview with the American minister in Brussels. They had seen him several times before, but on this occasion it was the minister who sent for them. He had previously been kind and interested in Eugenia's case, but so far his goodwill had not availed in her behalf. He could only offer his goodwill because it was not possible to demand the prisoner's liberation when she had frankly confessed her offense against the German administration. Yet as soon as they were permitted to enter the study where the minister was seated at his desk, Mildred Thornton had her first moment of hopefulness. For Mr. Whitlock had become her friend since this trouble began, and his expression indicated good news. There was no use going into particulars, he declared, but some days before he had received certain letters from Washington. It appeared that Judge Thornton had been to Washington in Eugenia's behalf, according to his daughter's request, where he must have interviewed persons of importance. Whatever took place, the American minister now announced that he had placed George Thornton's communications before the proper German officials. Whether they were influenced by these letters, or whether they concluded that there was more to be lost than gained by detaining their prisoner under the present conditions, it is impossible to say. The important fact was that Eugenia might at last be moved to her own house. There she was to be allowed to stay under guard until such time as she could safely leave the country. She would then be conducted to the border line of Holland and allowed to depart. But Eugenia Peabody was never again to set foot within a German country during the course of the present war. If she should enter it, she would immediately become liable to arrest. So in spite of the possible danger, Eugenia was immediately removed to her own house in the woods, the house supposedly inhabited by a ghost. But instead of a ghost, it was now haunted by the other 3 Red Cross girls, all of whom insisted upon sharing the labor of caring for Eugenia and looking after her home. Yet, after all, it was on Margaret Meade that the largest share of the burden fell, for the children had grown accustomed to her since their first friend's departure. Then, by a freak of chance, Eugenia seemed to wish Barbara near her the greater part of the time. She was not conscious, so her desire was only an eccentricity of illness. Nevertheless, Barbara naturally tried to be with her friend whenever it was humanly possible. So it is easy to see why Dick Thornton found no opportunity to confide in Barbara the dream that lay so near his heart. He saw her now and then, of course, in his own frequent visits to the household, but seldom alone. Occasionally, when for a moment he had a chance for a quiet word with her, Dick was not willing to intrude his own desires. Barbara looked so worn and fragile these days. The roundness had gone from her cheeks as well as their color. Her eyes and lips rarely smiled. It would only trouble her further to have him cast his burden upon her, for Barbara would of course be sorry to cause him unhappiness. So Dick decided to wait until serener times. One afternoon, however, the opportunity for encrusting one of his secrets arrived. For the past 3 days, Eugenia had been growing continuously weaker. The crisis of her disease had passed, and her fever was not so high, but her weakness had become a more dangerous symptom. About 4 o'clock, Dick drove out to the house in the woods with Dr. Mason, who was one of the physicians devoting himself to Eugenia's case. He did not go indoors, but asked that one of the 3 American Red Cross girls be sent out to speak to him. It was a cold afternoon, yet the sun was shining, and Dick felt that the fresh air would be a benefit. No matter which of the 3 girls was free to join him, they could walk up and down in the yard for a few minutes. The suspense of waiting for Dr. Mason's verdict would be less severe outdoors than shut up inside. But although Dick walked up and down the front porch for quite 10 minutes, no one appeared. Either Dr. Mason had forgotten to deliver his message, or else the girls were too busy or too nervous to leave the house. Dick finally grew weary of the veranda as a place for a promenade. A little later someone would be sure to come out to him, and in the meantime he would walk a short distance into the woods. A few yards along the path the young man stumbled across Barbara. She was wearing her gray blue nursing cape and was sitting upon a log. She looked so tiny and so huddled, so close that Dick somehow thought of a little gray squirrel. Barbara was so engrossed in her thoughts to hear him until he was almost upon her. Then Dick grew frightened because instead of speaking, she jumped to her feet and put up her hand to her throat as if she were choking. It occurred to Dick that she was terrified. He did not dream that she had run away from the house because she dared not wait to hear Dr. Mason's decision in regard to Eugenia. Now, of course, she thought him sent to her with a message. And the worst of it was Dick did not say a word. He simply stared at her, mute and sorrowful, because gay little Bab had become such a pathetic figure on this November afternoon. Dick's silence could mean but one thing to the girl. She made a little fluttering sound, wavered, and the next moment Dick was holding her upright on her feet with both his arms. At the same instant, Barbara forgot both Eugenia and herself. She had felt the world grown dark before her eyes a moment before. Now a miracle brought her back to her senses. She drew herself away at once and stood upright, then placed both her hands on Dick Thornton's two arms. "Dick," she said in an odd tone, "didn't you use both your arms just now when you kept me from falling?" Her companion nodded. "I have been meaning to tell you, Barbara, but you've been too busy with other things. My arm has been growing stronger each day, but I did not know myself until this minute that I could use the lame one as easily as I could the good. I suppose because I was frightened about you, I forgot my own weakness." Then, while Barbara was gazing at her friend in silence, but with her eyes expressing her joy in his news, Mildred Thornton came running along the path toward them. "Dr. Mason says Eugenia is much better this afternoon. He has the greatest hopes of her," she cried, while still several yards away. Jean recognized Nona and asked for something to eat. Nona says she even objected to the way in which she gave her medicine. So I suppose we have the old Jean back again. Come with me, Barbara dear. Dr. Mason says we may both speak to her. Afterwards, she is to be left alone to go to sleep, and I shall have to try to keep the children quiet. You must see if you can get Jan away from her door. The boy has not moved from there since 6 this morning." Then Mildred condescended to recognize her brother, but after kissing him hurriedly, she put her arm around Barbara's waist and both girls fled back to the house. Later Dick returned to town without seeing either one of them again that afternoon. End of chapter 18, recorded by Kristin Lewis, Houston, Texas.
Chapter 19 of The Red Cross Girls in Belgium. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The Red Cross Girls in Belgium by Margaret Vandercook. Chapter 19. En route. Barbara Meade was chosen as the suitable one of the three girls to accompany Eugenia out of Belgium. There were a number of reasons for this decision, but the most important was that her friends agreed she was most in need of a change. Another point was that Eugenia appeared to prefer to have her. But the journey could not be expected to be an altogether pleasant one. Eugenia was still ill enough to be a responsibility, and moreover, the German authorities did not hesitate to express their wish to be rid of her as soon as possible. It was for this reason that the trip was planned as soon as it was in the least feasible. Toward the middle of December, the preparations for departure were finally concluded. It was arranged that Nona Davis and Mildred Thornton should remain in charge of Eugenia's house in the woods for a time, for the children must continue being cared for. Therefore, the American hospital in Brussels had agreed temporarily to dispense with their services. Later on, perhaps, it might be possible to make a more definite arrangement. But at present, Nona and Mildred were both pleased to have a change in their work. Besides, this change afforded them the chance to stay on with their friends until the actual time of their leave-taking. Neither of the four girls ever forgot the final moment of farewell. Since daylight they had talked about everything else under the sun except the fact that they might not meet again for many months, for under the circumstances, naturally their future plans were indefinite. Barbara and Eugenia had been informed that they would be escorted to the frontiers of Holland. Once within the neutral state, no further observation would be made of them, and they could go where they chose. They had determined to cross at once to England, and then, lingering only long enough for Eugenia to rest, to travel by slow stages to southern France. Once there, they were once more to take refuge in the little farmhouse with the blue front door. For in the midst of Eugenia's illness a letter had arrived from Madame Castaigne. In it she had demanded that Miss Peabody be removed at once from a country at present overrun by barbarians. In her opinion, the American Red Cross girls should never have departed from the protection of her beloved France. Whenever it was possible, the farmhouse was at their disposal. Moreover, Madame Castaigne suffered for their companionship, for she and François had been entirely alone for months. Captain Castaigne was away in another part of the country with his regiment, so it had been both Eugenia's and Barbara's fancy to go back for a time to the little house they had both loved. When Eugenia had entirely recovered her health, they could then decide on the next step. At Eugenia's request, no one of their many friends in Brussels came out to say good-bye on the last day. For her own sake, and the happiness of the children, she wished her departure to be as quiet as possible. She and Barbara were therefore ready and waiting by noon, when the German officer arrived who was to take them to the border line. Neither of the girls had been informed who this man might be, nor what his character and rank. Personally, Barbara felt a considerable anxiety. So much of the comfort of the first of their journey would depend on his courtesy. Then there was the chance that Eugenia might be less strong than they hoped and fall ill again along the way. Yet Eugenia herself seemed to have no qualms upon the subject. Her one desire appeared to get away, to return to the country she had wilfully turned her back upon, for it had been chiefly due to Eugenia's influence that the American Red Cross girls had left France to begin a new service in Belgium. Finally, when the German officer arrived, Nona, Mildred, and Barbara were equally discouraged by his manner and appearance. In the first place, he was a man of a rough and surly exterior. He was only a sergeant, with an overbearing and insolent method of speaking. Indeed, he made no pretense of treating Eugenia in any way except as an intruder who had come dangerously near being a traitor to his government. Therefore, he had nothing but scorn and dislike of her. He would have chosen to travel with his prisoner in handcuffs, but since this had been forbidden, she should be allowed no other consideration. So Nona and Mildred had to kiss their friends good-bye with the German sergeant staring at them disdainfully. Then, before they realized what was taking place, they beheld Eugenia and Barbara being marched down the path toward a car which was to take them to their train. Eugenia could scarcely keep up with the rapid pace demanded of her. She looked very ill and fragile, and Barbara very tiny to have her clinging for support to her arm. Neither Mildred nor Nona could see distinctly at the last. Afterwards they remembered that Eugenia and Bab had both waved their hands just as the motor car plunged ahead down the narrow path through the woods. They had promised to write as soon as it was possible to get a letter through the lines, but there was a chance that their mail must first be sent to the United States and then have to recross the ocean. Naturally, the two girls who had been left behind were deeply depressed. Yet they had little time for reflection, for Eugenia had asked that the children be given a feast as soon as she was safely out of the way. Moreover, there was Nicolette dissolved in tears. She had wished to accompany her friend, but on account of Monsieur Bébé's helplessness had been persuaded to remain behind. Work is ever the solace of sorrow, as Mildred and Nona both discovered 10 minutes after their parting from the other two Red Cross girls. But Eugenia and Barbara had no such immediate consolation. Half a dozen times in the next few hours Barbara greatly desired to start a war on her own account, yet in spite of her somewhat fiery temperament she could say and do nothing. It was not on her own account that she was so angry, but for the sake of her friend. For notwithstanding her apparent weakness, Eugenia was forced to travel in a train so crowded that she started upon her journey standing up. Barbara's protest against this as an impossibility availed nothing, but a few moments later a Belgian woman took compassion upon them. She was old but sturdy and determined, and Eugenia's refusal to occupy her place she would not consider. Moreover, the girl had by this time reached such a condition that she must either sit down or fall. Though desiring her to be as wretched as possible, even her guard appreciated this fact. Afterwards, Barbara decided that she had never gone through more trying hours than those she endured on their way into Holland. Eugenia scarcely spoke a dozen words. Indeed, she appeared happily unconscious of a great deal of the insolence levelled at her. But Barbara missed nothing. The sergeant's every glance at Eugenia was an insult. Whenever he spoke to her, it was with a growl. Perhaps his task of driving an American girl out of a once friendly country was such a disagreeable one that no one except a bear would have wished to undertake it. However, both Barbara and Eugenia were willing exiles. The moment when the girls realized that their feet were upon Dutch soil was the happiest they had spent in many weeks. For here at last their guard said good-bye to them. At least, though he used no words, his behavior had the effect of a good-bye. What he actually did was to deposit them upon the platform of a railroad station, then with a grunt of disfavor turn and stride away. But the girls both knew that the next train on which they were to travel would run through the peaceful Dutch country. By night they arrived at a Dutch port. In spite of the peril of floating mines and submarines, the Holland passenger boats were still making their nightly journeys to the English coast. Naturally, there were but few passengers aboard, as no one was crossing for pleasure. But tonight there were a small number of business men and a few women. At 8 o'clock in the evening their boat sailed, and immediately after Barbara and Eugenia went to bed. Food was brought to their stateroom, but they were too weary and too excited to eat, so it was scarcely 9 o'clock when they were both sound asleep. Of course they appreciated the possible danger of their crossing, but as a matter of fact neither Barbara nor Eugenia gave the idea 5 minutes' thought. When one has lived in the midst of war's tragedies and terrors, one no longer worries over possible misfortunes. There is time enough when the blow falls. Therefore, at midnight, the two friends were peacefully sleeping, when they were awakened by an extraordinary sensation and then a tumultuous noise. Suddenly, their little steamer had come to an abrupt halt in mid-sea. There was no warning, no gradual slowing down. One moment they had been traveling at full speed, the next they were at a complete standstill. Then there began a tremendous rushing about on the deck above the floor where the two American Red Cross girls had their berths. Soon after a heavy splash followed, as if something had been dropped into the sea. Although they were both awakened with the first reversal of the boat's engines, neither of the girls spoke until after the noise subsided. Then it was Eugenia. "Something extraordinary has happened, Bab dear," she said quietly. "I think you had best go and see what it is. I have a feeling that perhaps our boat is going to sink, but there has been no explosion so far." Eugenia was extraordinarily calm, almost passive. One may not believe this state of mind to be possible, but wait until you have had such a personal experience with danger. Barbara's answer was to scramble quickly out of the upper berth. She chanced to be wearing a warm blue wrapper which served as a gown, so now she only needed to slip her fur coat over it and pull down her gray squirrel cap over her brown curls. "Be getting dressed, Eugenia, while I find out what has happened. I'll come back in a moment," she advised. But once outside her stateroom, Barbara discovered only a mild excitement. A few passengers were running up and down the narrow hallway, clinging to scanty costumes. One of them explained the situation to Barbara. "Nothing's much amiss. We are all getting too nervous these days," he commented. "Our ship has just run up against a solid bank of fog. As we can't see an inch ahead of us, our captain has too good sense to go on in the darkness. We may have to stay here an hour or 24. There is no telling. Hope a submarine won't come along and pick us off." And with this parting pleasantry, Barbara's new acquaintance departed. The next instant Barbara returned and opened her stateroom door. "Go back to sleep, Jean dear. Everything is serene," she said reassuringly. "There is only a heavy fog at sea. I want to go up on deck and investigate, so please don't worry about me." A few moments later Barbara was groping her way about on deck until she discovered an empty steamer chair. This she crawled into, tucking her feet up under her and snuggling down close in the darkness. She could still hear the sailors rushing about on deck. Now and then she could even catch the dim outline of a figure, but nothing else was discernible. The very lights suspended from the ship's side were pale and flickering. Yet it was all immensely interesting. Outside the ship both sky and water had apparently ceased to exist. One could see only a solid mass of gray-black fog, like a wet and heavy veil overspreading the world. Barbara had recovered from her fatigue with her few hours of sleep. Never had she felt more wide awake or more excited. If only it were possible to see more. Suddenly she jumped up from her chair. It is true the decks were wet and slippery, and since she could not see her way about, nor be seen, she might be in danger of falling. Nevertheless, Barbara decided to risk the danger. A tumble more or less need not be serious, and she was freezing from sitting still. And yet she had not the faintest intention or desire of going back to her stateroom. The fog might last for many hours, but then there was the chance that it might lift at any moment. Barbara greatly desired to see the spectacle of a familiar world emerging from darkness into light. Fortunately, her side of the deck appeared to be entirely deserted. She rose and walked a few steps up and down, compelled to go slowly, for the fog lay like a damp weight upon her chest, pressing her backward with its dim, invisible hands. But after a little time, growing bolder when the desire to gaze down into the water swept over her, she turned and walked blindly forward. Within a few paces she reached out to grasp the ship's rails. But instead her hands touched something warm and human. Immediately she gave a smothered cry of embarrassment and fright. "I am so sorry," she murmured apologetically, then with a characteristic laugh, "but I really don't know whether I have run into you or you into me. Will you please move to the right and I'll go to the left, then we need never meet again." "Barbara," began a familiar voice. For the second time the girl's hands stretched forward, but this time they clung to the coat of the young fellow standing within a few feet of her. "Dick Thornton, can it possibly? This is you? When you are in Brussels?" she protested. "But then how can it be any one except you, although I have not seen you? If it is only your ghost I am holding on to, at least it is a very substantial one, and I never was so glad to meet any other ghost in my life." In answer, Dick Thornton laughed out loud. Did anyone in the world ever talk in such a ridiculous fashion as Barbara, and yet was there ever anyone so delightful? He slipped his arm through the girl's. "Let us walk up and down for a few moments while I explain the reality of my presence," he suggested, quietly taking his companion's consent for granted. "Personally, I think it would be the more surprising if I were not here. Did you think for an instant I would allow you and Eugenia to go on this long trip alone, when Eugenia has been so ill? I did not mention the subject to you girls, since I did not intend to have a discussion, but whether you allow it or not, I shall be your faithful follower until you reach the little French farmhouse." Barbara's eyes were swimming with unexpected tears. "You are the kindest person in the world always, Dick," she answered, "and I can't tell you how glad I am to have you with us. I did dread the responsibility of Jean more than I would confess. Besides, I want you to see our house with the blue front door. But I wonder if it is fair to Mildred and Nona to have you leave them for even a short time. Your place is with them rather than anyone else, isn't it?" "My place is beside you, Barbara, whenever you are willing to have me." Dick returned in such a matter-of-fact fashion that his companion did not at once understand the meaning of his words. "Your place beside me?" she repeated slowly. "Why, how is that possible, when Mildred is your sister and Nona—" But Dick was drawing her toward the side of the ship, and now they were both leaning against the railing, looking down at the glossy darkness beneath them. "Yes, Mildred is my sister and Nona my friend," Dick continued, "yet neither one of them can mean to me what the girl I would choose above all others to be my wife means. Don't answer me for a moment, Barbara. I have no delusion about your feeling for me, but that makes no difference. I want you to know that ever since those first days in New York, you have filled the greater portion of my world. No matter what may happen to divide us, nor how far your life may lead away from mine, I shall not change." The girl and man were standing with only a few feet of each other. Now Barbara moved closer and laid her hand on her companion's coat sleeve. "I am not very anxious for anything to divide us, nor for my life to lead far away from yours," she whispered. At this moment the bank of fog rolled up as if it were a stage curtain being raised in answer to the prompter's bell, when for the first time that evening Dick and Barbara caught the vision of each other's faces. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Red Cross Girls in Belgium. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The Red Cross Girls in Belgium by Margaret Vandercook. Noel. It was Christmas morning in southern France. For several hours a light snow had been falling, but had not stayed upon the ground. Yet it clothed the branches of the trees with white lace and filled the air with jewels. Walking alone, a slender girl with dark hair and eyes lifted her face to let the snow melt upon her cheeks. She looked fragile, as if she were just recovering from an illness, nor did her expression betray any special interest in Christmas. "These woods are as lovely as I remember them," she said aloud. "It is true I never could find a place in Belgium I liked half so well." Then she stopped a moment and glanced around her. "I do hope Barbara and Dick won't discover I have run away. I feel as much a truant as if I were a small girl. But they surely won't be tramping through my woods at present, when they assured me they would spend several hours at the chateau. So I can't be found out till it is too late. I feel I must see Nicolette's little log house and Nona's pool of Melisande." 10 minutes after Eugenia arrived at the desired place, the lake of clear water which she had once described as the Pool of Truth was today covered with a thin coating of ice at its edges. The center was as untroubled as it had always been. Above it tall evergreen trees leaned so close to one another that their summits almost touched. Eugenia breathed deeply of the fragrance of the snow and the pine. The day was an unusually cold one for this part of the country, but the winter was being everywhere severe. It was as if nature would make no easier the task of her children's destruction of each other. But Eugenia was not thinking of warlike things at this hour. She was merely feeling a physical pleasure in her own returning strength. Yet, just as she was congratulating herself on having been able to walk so far without tiring, the girl experienced a sudden, overpowering sensation of fatigue. For several moments she stood upright, fighting her weakness. She even turned and started back toward home. Then, recognizing her own folly, Eugenia looked for a place to rest. But she did not look very far, nor in but one direction. Yes, the log was there in the same place it had been 6 months before. With a half smile at herself, Eugenia sat down. She was not deceived, for she understood perfectly why she had wished to come back to this neighborhood, and why today she had wanted to walk alone into these woods. But there could be no wrong in what she was doing, since no one would ever guess her reason. Eugenia was sincerely pleased over Barbara's and Dick's happiness, but she would never confess herself so completely surprised as Barbara demanded that she be. She merely announced that if one of the girls felt compelled to marry, and she supposed they could not all hope to escape the temptation of their nursing experiences in Europe, at least she was grateful that Barbara had chosen to bestow her affection upon an American. Personally, she felt convinced that no foreign marriage could be a success. Yet here sat Eugenia in an extremely sentimental attitude, with the light snow falling about her. More than this, she was in an equally sentimental state of mind. But then nothing of this kind matters when one chances to be entirely alone. Dreams are one's own possession. Then the girl heard a sound that entirely accorded with her train of thought. It was a slow, velvet-like tread moving in her direction. In another moment Duke had approached and laid his great head in her lap. He did not move again. There was no foolish wagging of his tail. These expressions of emotion were meant for lesser beasts. Duke revealed his joy and his affection in a beautiful, almost a thrilling silence. Eugenia had not seen her old friend since her arrival at the farmhouse a few days before. For some reason he had not called there with Francois, and she had not been outside the house until today. Their trip had been a long and tiring one, and she was more exhausted than she had expected to be. But this was a far more satisfactory reunion, and Eugenia was sincerely moved. She put her own thin cheek down on Duke's silver head and remained as still as he was. Truly, he had not forgotten. Captain Castaigne found them like this when he appeared within the next few seconds. He made no pretense of a greeting. Instead, he frowned upon his one-time friend as severely as she might have upon him had their positions been reversed. "It is not possible that you were in the woods in this snowstorm, Eugenie. Miss Meade told me that I should find you at the little farmhouse. Take my arm and we will return as quickly as possible." With entire meekness, Eugenia did as she was told. She did not even remember to be amused at this young Frenchman's amazing fashion of ordering her about. But she was surprised into speechlessness at his unexpected appearance. "Only yesterday your mother assured us you were in northern France with your regiment," Eugenia murmured, as she was being escorted along the path toward home. "She insisted that there was no possible prospect of your returning to this neighborhood in many months." Captain Castaigne smiled. "Is that American frankness, Eugenie? We French people prefer to leave certain things to the imagination. Of course I understand that you would never have come to the farmhouse had you dreamed of my being nearby. However, I am here for the purpose of seeing you. My mother did not intend to deceive you. I had not told her of my intention. But we will not talk of these things until we arrive at home. You are too weary to speak." This was so manifestly true that Eugenia made no attempt at argument. She was fatigued, and yet there was something else keeping her silent. How splendidly well Captain Castaigne looked! His face was less boyish than she remembered it, but then she had not understood him at the beginning of their acquaintance. It had been stupid of her, too, because no soldier receives the Cross of the Legion of Honor who has not put aside boyish things. Because it was Christmas Day, Noël as the French term it, the living room at the farmhouse was gay with evergreens. But better than this, a real fire burned in the fireplace. Eugenia let her companion take off her long nursing cloak, and she herself removed her cap. Then she stood revealed a different Eugenia, because of Barbara's taste and determination. Instead of her uniform or her usual shabby, ill-made dress, she wore an exquisite pale gray crêpe de chine, which made a beauty of her slenderness. About her throat there were folds of white, and in her belt a dull rose velvet rose. This costume had been purchased in Paris as the girls passed through, and Eugenia wore it today in honor of Christmas. Without a doubt Eugenia looked pale and ill, but her hair was twisted about her head like a dull brown coronet, and the shadows about her eyes revealed their new depth and sweetness. When she sat down again, drawing near the fire with a little shiver, Captain Castaigne came and knelt beside her. No American could have done this without awkwardness and self-consciousness. Yet there was no hint of either in the young French officer's attitude. Seeing him, Eugenia forgot her past narrowness and the critical misunderstanding of a nature that cannot appreciate temperaments and circumstances unlike their own. She was reminded of the picture of a young French knight, the Saint Louis of France, whom she had seen among the frescoes of the Pantheon in Paris. Very gravely Captain Castaigne raised Eugenia's hand to his lips. "I care for you more than I did when I told you of my love, and you would not believe. I shall go on caring. How long must I serve before you return my affection?" Eugenia shook her head fretfully like a child. But it isn't a question of my caring. I told you that there were 1,000 other things that stood between us, Henri." And she drew her hand away and laid it lightly upon the young man's head. "This house has many memories for me. Perhaps when I am an old woman you will let me come back here and live a part of each year. May I buy the house from your mother? Ask her as a favor to me?" Eugenia was trying her best to return to her old, half-maternal treatment of the young officer. This had been the attitude which she had used in the months of his illness in the little farmhouse with the blue front door. But this time their positions were reversed. "We will talk of that another time," he returned. "Now you must be fair with me. I will not accept such an answer as you gave me before. I must be told the truth." Captain Castaigne had gotten up and stood looking down upon Eugenia. "I return to my regiment tomorrow. You must tell me today." In reply the girl let her hands fall gently into her lap and gazed directly into the handsome, clear-cut face above her own. "Why should I try to deceive you? It would be only sheer pretense. You are the only man I have ever cared for or ever shall. But I'll never marry you under any possible circumstances. I am too old and too unattractive and too—oh, 100 other things." But Captain Castaigne was smiling in entire serenity. "We will marry at the little farmhouse with the blue front door during my next leave of absence." But Barbara and Dick were at this moment entering the blue front door. Half an hour later, when they had finished Christmas dinner, Dick Thornton drew a magazine from his pocket which had on its cover the sign of the Red Cross. "Here is a poem someone in America has written called 'She of the Red Cross.' Will you listen while I read it to you? To me the poem, of course, means Barbara, and to Captain Castaigne, Eugenia. She fulfills the dramatic destiny of woman, because she stands valiant in the presence of pestilence, and faces woe unafraid, and binds up the wounds made by the wars of men. She fights to defeat pain and to conquer torture, and to cheat death of his untimely prey. And her combat is for neither glory nor gain, but, with charity and mercy and compassion as her weapons, she storms incessantly the ramparts of grief. There thrills through her life never the sharp, sudden thunder of the charge, never the swift and ardent rush of the short, decisive conflict. The tumult of applauding nations does not reach her ears, and the courage that holds her heart high comes from the voice of her invincible soul. She fulfills the dramatic destiny of woman because, reared to await the homage of man and to receive his service, she becomes, when the war trump sounds, the servitor of the world. And because whenever men have gone into battle, women have borne the real burden of the fray. And because, since the beginning of time, man, when he is hurt or maimed, turns to her and finds, in her tenderness, the consolation and comfort which she alone can give. Then she of the Red Cross stands today, as woman has stood always, the most courageous and the most merciful figure in all history. She is the valor of the world. End of chapter 20. End of Red Cross Girls in Belgium by Margaret Vandercook.